Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. On behalf of His Excellency Dr. Jamal Sanad Al-Suwaidi, Director General of the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, we would like to welcome you all to the center where we are gathered here this evening for the much anticipated lecture, The World Today, a conversation with Nicolas Sarkozy. Nicolas Sarkozy served as the President of the French Republic from 2007 to 2012, a position he attained after years spent dedicating his life to a highly esteemed and richly diverse political career in France. Prior to his presidency, President Sarkozy occupied various ministerial posts, including Minister of State, Minister of the Interior, Minister of the Economy, and Minister of Budget. For the past year, he has served as the President of the French political party Les Républicains, formerly known as the Union for a Popular Movement, a position he previously occupied from 2004 to 2007. President Sarkozy has received numerous honors, including the Grand Cross of Legion of Honor, Grand Cross of the National Order of Merit, Grand Cross of the Royal Order of Charles III in Spain, Honorary Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath, United Kingdom, and Knight of the Golden Fleece, Spain. A prolific writer, President Sarkozy is the author of several books, including Free in 2001, The Republic, Religion's Hope 2004, Testimony 2006, and Together in 2007. After completing his undergraduate education in political science at the Institute of Political in Paris, Political Studies in Paris, President Sarkozy completed his master's degree in private law in 1978 and his certificate to practice law in 1981. Born in Paris on January 28, 1955, President Sarkozy is married and has 4 children. Prior to his political career, he worked as a lawyer and was a member of the Paris Bar Association. Now I am pleased to invite President Nicolas Sarkozy to present his lecture.
Mesdames et messieurs,
Ladies and gentlemen,
c'est toujours étrange pour moi
it's
d'entendre parler
always quite
de ma carrière.
strange for me, really, to hear my career described, because in my own head, I'm still 22 years of
Je ne me
age,
souviens pas d'avoir fait tout cela.
and I actually don't remember doing all of
Un
that.
grand honneur.
It's a great honor, in any case, to have been invited as your guest today.
C'est un grand honneur parce que
It's a great honor to me because,
j'aime depuis longtemps votre pays.
of course, I have loved your country
Je crois
for
dans votre pays depuis
a
longtemps.
very long time. I've been a strong believer in this country for a very long time. And those are not empty words that I'm
Ce
saying.
sont des faits.
Those are facts.
J'ai voulu, avec Son Altesse Cheikh Mohammed bin
Now,
Zayed,
together with His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed,
créer le Louvre
I
à Abu Dhabi,
gave the first impetus to the creation of the Louvre here in Abu Dhabi,
Abu Dhabi,
as to the creation of the Sorbonne, Abu
et créer
Dhabi.
une base militaire.
Together, we also wanted to create a French military base here in Abu Dhabi. And the opening up of that military base was certainly a very difficult political decision, because that was the very first
Que la France ouvre
military base
à
opened
l'extérieur de ses
by
frontières
France outside its
le
borders
lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale.
since the immediate aftermath of the war. Now, why did we take that decision?
Parce que, mesdames et messieurs, dans les relations internationales,
Well,
en
ladies and
général,
gentlemen,
en
very
politique,
generally speaking, in international relations and the field of politics more specifically, you hear a lot of discourses about
très peu souvent des
friendship,
amitiés.
but you see very few proofs of friendship.
Sont plus importantes que les
And I do believe that proofs of friendship are considerably more important than statements of friendship. Now, what is
Je
at
veux le
stake
dire en
here?
remerciant très chaleureusement votre
I want to say that as I thank very warmly your Director General, Dr. Jamal Sanad Al-Suwaidi.
Je joue ici
What is at stake here
la vision
is the very
de vos dirigeants
vision that was put forward by your leaders who are trying to do something extraordinarily difficult as they reconcile their identity with the modernity of the times, as they strive to remain true to Islam, Islam that you're strong believers in, all while opening up to the world around us, this world that you all want to embrace thoroughly. That is what is at stake here today, in the Emirates generally, and in Abu Dhabi more specifically. There are very few places on this planet, very few places where that choice was made to reconcile identity, a strong identity and modernity. That is the choice that was made right here. And that choice was made on the basis of the vision put forward by His Highness Sheikh Mohammed. If you are successful, and you're certainly on the road to success, that will stand as proof that countries with an Islamic culture and religion can bring together their tradition and economic and scientific progress and open up to the world. Your success will send out a message of hope for the world as a whole. That hope will stand, of course, for the Arab world in general, but it will also be a very significant hope for everyone throughout the world who places their hopes in peace. Now, I have come to Abu Dhabi a great many times. I come to Abu Dhabi several times a year, in fact. And on every occasion I see this country and this city change dramatically. If you think for a minute that this country emerged on the international scene at the beginning of the 1970s. Now, I don't know if the Emiratis and the inhabitants of Abu Dhabi truly realize what you have achieved in just 2 generations. Your grandparents were men and women of the desert. Today, we have before our eyes, in the place of that desert, architectural wonders of the world, where there once was sand, where there were tents, where there were nomadic populations. Well, over the space of just a couple generations, you have built some of the most modern cities in the world. How many places on the planet can boast such an achievement over the past 40 or 50 years? Your own sons, your own daughters, or, well, first of all, your forefathers, of course, and your fathers, and now your children are studying the best universities of the world. They're, in some cases, the first generation to do so. Your children hold hosts of degrees, and that also stands as an example sent out by the Emirates to the rest of the world. Now, this morning, together with Pierre Lelouch, we were visiting that extraordinary museum that the Louvre Abu Dhabi is set to become. Very possibly one of the most beautiful museums in the world. And a young lady who was born in Abu Dhabi was extremely proud there to introduce me to the future collections, and I could see there, side by side, the Quran, the Torah, together with representations of the Christian religion. I could see before my eyes extraordinary works of art, the most ancient and the most modern, together bearing witness to the will of the Crown Prince to turn Abu Dhabi into a crossroads of the world's cultures. Where else is anything similar achieved? Where else is that kind of risk taken? Where else would you see such open-mindedness? Who else addresses to the world such a strong message. I myself can bear witness to the fact that it's His Highness who wanted to see this Louvre Abu Dhabi. And of course, the French were willing, but we had to have our arm twisted somewhat, and I know what I'm talking about, because I know how conservatism had to be fought over in France. And this morning, when I saw that dome designed by that great French architect, Jean Nouvel, that dome with the lattice work filtering the light, that dome under which we'll soon find together the Emirati tradition and the most modern works of art in the world, I was deeply impressed. And your success, again, will send out a message of hope well beyond the borders of your own country. Now, when I decided, as I was saying, to open up that French military base, that, to me, was a message addressed to the 10 million inhabitants of this country. I wanted to say that France stood by your side and that there would be French soldiers standing on your soil, and that it would be important for your neighbors to know that France was on your soil and French soldiers were on your soil to express their friendship and solidarity. And dear friends, these are not just soldiers who are in for a quick tour before they head back home. These are families and children who come together with our troops, who come to stay, to signal in no uncertain terms that the friendship between France and the Emirates is a strategic friendship that does not hinge on the whim on one or another man, but that will be a long-standing friendship. And you, of course, know better perhaps than most what a long-standing friendship is, because your trust is difficult to conquer, but once you have won it over, you have it forever. Here, it is well understood what long-lasting friendships mean. Of course, some people come to visit and promise, wonders, and then never come back. You've seen a great many of those, and I know what you like to see is friends who come over again and again and again, as often as is needed to cast robust bridges between us. Now, as you have chosen to become this crossroads of cultures and times and to embody that open-mindedness and to embrace the world and to also become models of moderation, well, at the same time, a number of your neighbors have decided otherwise and have taken different paths. And I want to say before this assembly that the Middle East stands doubtless today at a watershed moment of its history. The Middle East over the past few years has been radically upheaved, and that upheaval is gradually transforming this region in depth, and those transformations will hold consequences for every one of us in this very stormy context. Allow me, as a friend, to say that, in my eyes, the very first challenge will lie in your capacity to maintain the diversity that exists today in the Middle East. In fact, that is one point on which I disagreed with President Bush. When President Bush spoke of the East, President Bush liked to speak of his wish to see democracy spread throughout the region. It was a very generous idea, of course. But I have to say that even more important than the spread of democracy is diversity. The East is, by its very nature, diverse, and that has always stood as one of its assets and its strengths. You're faced today, I believe, with two major challenges in that respect. The first challenge lies in the conflict opposing today the Shia and the Sunni. Now, I am not an Arab myself.
Je ne suis pas musulman.
I am not a Muslim.
Et je n'ai donc pas à m'immiscer.
And therefore, I certainly don't mean to interfere in a situation that is of your concern. But please allow a friend to say that this opposition between Shia and Sunni is a source of great concern for all of your friends worldwide. The East is an embodiment of diversity. And that first challenge is a challenge that you will rise through reconciliation, because both Sunni and Shia are absolutely necessary to the East, as are Christians, as are Jews, as are all the other minorities who are present in the region. Now, General de Gaulle used to say that it was useful to approach the complexity of the East with simple ideas. Well, that's the one simple idea that I have to offer. Place your hopes in the strength of that diversity. And when you see today all those countries, Iran, Iraq, Syria, which through the diversity of their populations enjoyed that treasure trove of diversity in the past, all those countries that are now threatened with implosion, that is of course another source of huge concern. And I strongly believe, Mr. Ambassador, that the role of a country such as France lies in providing proof of friendship, which I believe I have done, but also to talk to everyone. I think that is, in a sense, our mission. The day, perforce, will come when people of goodwill will have to speak to everyone around the table. Now, another considerable challenge that you're faced with today is that of the conflict that is tearing through Islam today, the conflict among the huge majority of the Muslims who live their faith happily and peacefully on the one hand, and on the other hand, that tiny minority of people who pervert Islam and warp it. In France, there were over 130 casualties in November last, and I cannot begin to describe the depth of the trauma that that represented for our country, and how the French people were simply overwhelmed with grief. Well, one tiny minority on behalf of a perverted Islam is killing, is assassinating, is displaying the most barbaric behavior. And there can be no such thing as a compromise between them and us, or between them and you. This is a war we're talking about. This is what I would describe as a third world war. If you do not understand that this is a state of war, you will never have the means or the wherewithal to exit this impasse, this dead end where these terrorists want to take us. This is a conflict between civilization and barbarism. To say it in other terms, this war can only be won through the total annihilation of all extremists, jihadists, and terrorists. And I weigh my words. When you're waging war, you wage it to win it. And winning a war means annihilating those forces of barbarism that are pitted against civilization today. If we want to win this war, we will have to stand united. Now, of course, I'm fully aware of the fact that any conflict stems from a complexity and a diversity of deep causes, but nonetheless, I do believe that if we were to underestimate the threat at hand, then we could not but see a great many more terrorist attacks. How many attacks have we already seen in New York, in Madrid, in London, in Paris, and elsewhere in so many other places in the world? We have to understand by now that we have to wage a total war, and we have to wage it now. Now, of course, that will represent tremendous tensions, very country tensions, which I believe I have just underlined. Now, against that very general backdrop, we can also raise more specific questions, such as that of Iran, for instance. Now, that certainly is one huge source of concern, particularly in this country, one source of concern that's raised over and over again on the occasion of every one of my visits. Iran is always at the center of the conversations. And here again, I would like to share with you a number of very clear insights, because in my mind, things have always been very clear. I want to say it once again, in no uncertain words, Iran holding nuclear weapons would very simply be unacceptable. Now, that is not a topic for academic conversation. It's simply unacceptable for a number of reasons to do with Iran, but also for the simple reason that if Iran were to develop a nuclear bomb, how much time would it take for Turkey to claim a right to have the bomb, for Saudi Arabia to claim the same right? And what would happen then in this part of the world on the day that all those regional powers have nuclear capacity, with all the tensions that are in the air? That topic certainly cannot be taken lightly. Now, the agreement that was recently reached, at least in my mind, still contains too many ambiguities and too many uncertainties. Most of the measures that it provides for will only be applied for 10 to 15 years, which, if we're talking about nuclear programs, I mean, that's simply the day after tomorrow. And I'm quite willing to admit that the status quo that had been in place for the past few years was not satisfying, because while that status quo was maintained, the centrifuges were still turning. But I cannot fail to comment on the fact that, by way of this agreement, the international community marked a fundamental change in approach. The international community now explicitly acknowledges the right for Iran to have uranium-enriching activities and research and development activities, even though all of those activities will be very clearly framed. It is a fundamental change because, to date, the international community had always demanded a complete stop to any Iranian activities, nuclear activities. Now, I'm not saying things were easy. I'm not saying it was easy to find an agreement. I'm not saying anything other than the fact that, up until recently, a change in doctrine was inconceivable, and that now things are framed in a very different light. Now, the fact remains that that agreement will have to be implemented now, and much depends on the way in which it will be implemented, on the level of controls that will be imposed, not just on the letter of the agreement, but on the ground, the controls that will be imposed on the Iranians. And I certainly believe that that level of controls has to be as high as can possibly be arranged, because on a topic of this importance, any naivete, any complacency must be ruled out entirely. The Iranians, of course, will have to demonstrate as they apply the agreement and through concrete actions in the region. Have in mind, of course, Yemen and Bahrain. It's for Iran to demonstrate that they want to be reintegrated in the community of nations as a constructive power. I cannot fail but see that to date that has not been the case, which doesn't mean that we should not be talking to the Iranians. I would even add further that the more disagreements there are between us, the more we need to talk. Because, quite honestly, dialogue with people with whom you agree on everything, well, certainly takes a lot less time than conversation with or dialogue with people with whom you disagree. And, talking here about a country that's, what, 200 kilometers away, and that certainly makes it a very concrete topic, nothing academic. Now, to go back to the conflict between Sunnis and Shia, well, that conflict has also considerably fed into the conflict in Yemen, a conflict that your country has been tackling for several months now. Now, peace negotiations are gradually getting underway. Those negotiations must be successful, and we must reach peace, because local populations have already paid much too high a price in that conflict. And I would also add that the chaos in Yemen, well, who stands to profit from that chaos in Yemen? The terrorist groups, the jihadist groups, Al-Qaeda and Daesh are said to benefit the most from the chaos in that region, which is why it is so urgent today to see those peace negotiations through. Now, from that standpoint, or from that standpoint, we're led to consider the Syrian situation as having covered the Sunni-Shia conflict, the Iranian nuclear program, Yemen. Well, we're naturally led into Syria. Syria, a magnificent country, one of the greatest civilizations in world history, in humankind, in universal culture. Well, that magnificent country, for the past 5 years, has suffered a martyr, as we're reminded today by the very tragic situation in Madaya, this city that has become an emblem of the suffering of Syrians. For 5 years now, the Syrian people have been suffering a martyr. Now, of course, I would say that the complexity of the Syrian situation stems from the fact that it stands at the crossfire of the two conflicts between Shia and Sunni on the one hand, and on the other hand between civilization and barbarism. Now, I have to say, if you'll allow me, that too much time has been wasted by now. Much too much time has been wasted. And in the context of any international crisis, if you want to have half a chance to put an end to a deteriorating situation, you have to act fast, because time is never on your side. And I have to say again that as early as the summer of 2012, I had called for action on the part of the international community. Now, at the time, in Syria, there was still a powerful, moderate opposition. What have they become? They have been left to their own devices, without any arms, without any weapons, without any funding. Now, back in the summer 2012, there was no such thing as Daesh. There was no Islamic State on the cards. I'll also add, and I certainly hope that I won't offend anyone, but I will add that Russia will have to come to the table if we are to solve the Syrian situation also. The point is not whether we agree on everything with Vladimir Putin. The question lies in knowing whether or not Russia can be a factor for peace and part of the solution in Syria. Who can say today that we can solve the Syrian situation without Russia? That would be absurd. So, clearly, it is a major mistake to refuse to hold talks with Russia. Now, today, everybody agrees on that line. Today, yes, but how much time have we wasted? We have wasted 5 years. Another point I'd like to make is the following. I simply don't believe that we can solve the Syrian crisis without ground intervention of the Arab powers of the region who will benefit from the support of the international community. Who, in their right mind, could say that airstrikes will solve the Syrian crisis? If anyone is ready to hold that point of view, I'd be very interested in hearing their arguments. Of course, I would not dream of criticizing our air forces and our pilots who do extraordinary work. But if we are to solve the Syrian crisis, we need to commit to that. And if we truly intend to eradicate Daesh, then of course we need to strike them from the air, but we also need to occupy the ground. And who can occupy Arab soil, if not, first and foremost, a coalition of Arab countries and Arab armed forces? And I'm sure you understand why I'm saying that more specifically. Well, just recently with Pierre Lelouch, we were talking about France's role in the history of the early 20th century. Well, clearly everyone can see that airstrikes are helpful, but the only ground troops that can be relevant and part of the solution will be Arab troops, certainly not foreign troops or French troops. Now, it's unfortunate that that solution has not been adopted, despite the fact that a number of Arab countries were ready to commit to it. Now, of course, the Syrian crisis would be difficult enough to solve with just one coalition, but we have two coalitions. Now, how does that help? We simply cannot go forward with these two coalitions working in parallel, with some goals that are shared in common and some goals that diverge. Those two coalitions have to be brought into alignment against the Islamic State. That means that we're going to have to find the courage, as I did, to say to our Russian friends, to explain to them that they must give more breathing space to the Syrian nationalist opposition, because they are a source of fighters against Daesh. And of course, we cannot save Syria without the Syrians, without the Syrian people. Who could possibly imagine that Syria will be liberated without the Syrians themselves? Now, a number of efforts have been undertaken to bring in line those two coalitions. Unfortunately, those efforts have not been successful, and I would say that the renewed tensions between Iran and Saudi Arabia will not be helpful, to say the least. Now, there are two essential points on which discussions have stalled. The first is the fate of Bashar al-Assad. And on this point, I would really like to share with you a strong belief of mine. At the time, I talked at length with Bashar al-Assad, not about Syria, but about Lebanon, because that was the issue of the day. Lebanon, who had a legitimate right to live independently from Syria. Well, Bashar al-Assad is responsible for the death of 250,000 of his citizens. And who could tell me, who could say today that we can build the future of a country together with an individual who is personally responsible for the death of 250,000 of his own citizens? This is not a question of morality. It's a question of common sense. Who can tell me, to my face, well, thank you for your kind applause, who could tell me that this Syrian reconciliation that is of the essence today, that reconciliation can be brought about around this individual who was so instrumental in the martyrdom of his own people? Sooner or later, Bashar al-Assad will have to leave. That being said, it is also clear that no political solution will be possible without an agreement with the regime, and I'm talking about the Ba'ath Party and those who served that regime. I also believe it was a tremendous mistake that was committed in Iraq when, at the time, we refused to reintegrate the civil servants who had worked for Saddam Hussein. It was one thing to depose Saddam Hussein, it would be one thing to depose Bashar al-Assad. It's something entirely different to exclude any number of civil servants who, in all good faith, worked for the leader of their regime for years or decades. What else could they do? They are civil servants. Now, of course, we don't need to paint ourselves, we mustn't paint ourselves into a corner. we certainly should not wait for Bashar al-Assad to leave before we start discussions with the regime and before we start organizing a transition. Now, Bashar al-Assad's leaving cannot be a preamble to discussions, be it only because a great part of the discussions will focus on how to organize the transition and how to organize his departure. Now, some people say that that is a matter to be settled over the course of future elections. Surely those must be joking. It will be years, given the current situation, it will be years before we can organize credible elections in Syria. At the very least, a great many months. And of course, a required condition before that can be achieved is for discussions on the transition to have made progress. And of course, a number of stakeholders will simply steadfastly refuse to take part in those discussions, in those negotiations, if we stand by this sole objective of maintaining Bashar al-Assad as if nothing had happened. So we must also persuade those who still support Bashar al-Assad not only that his departure is a precondition for peace, but also that it is in their own interests. And I'm thinking, of course, of the Russians in particular. Now, the Russians have taken up leadership in the region over the past few months, but of course they have to stay on the good side of the Sunni powers. And I think even Iran would see an interest in organizing a negotiated and progressive gradual transition rather than see Syria go deeper into chaos. And what is the representativity today of Bashar al-Assad if you don't take into account the Hezbollah and the Russians? Now, there is another point on which the negotiations have stalled. And here again, I'd like to remind a number of important fundamental principles. First of all, we must rule out any kind of compromise with terrorist groups. The al-Nusra Front, which is linked to Al-Qaeda, and Daesh, of course. We cannot allow any compromise with them. But we must open up as broadly as possible to nationalist opposition forces without whom no reconciliation and no long-lasting peace will be possible. And the committee that was set up recently in Riyadh, I think, marks a very positive first step that we need to pursue. And opposition Syrians who have not already done so must join that committee as soon as can be arranged. Now let me add a third point that will add to the complexity of the situation. Well, it is a complex situation. What can I say? I'm fully aware of that. I will add that, of course, we need to stand firm and to refuse all compromise with radical Islamism. But we must also bear in mind that a number of moderate opposition members have joined organizations that are more radical than they would wish to be. And the reason for that is because we let them down. They had no funding, no money, no weapons, which is why a number of them decided to join groups that were more extremist than they were, if only to contribute and to do their part for the liberation of their nation. Now, I mentioned a tension within Islam, the tension opposing moderate Islam to Islamists and to terrorists and to jihadists who have declared war on us all. They have declared war on you as on us. We share this common enemy, and we must be partners and must stand united in this common war that we are waging. Of course, war, waging war, by definition, implies that you're waging war to win it. Unfortunately, we have neither the means nor the time to allow ourselves to waver. We must not hesitate for an instant, and we can certainly not allow ourselves to even talk about war if we're not going to wage it totally and fully. And I think the Arab and the Muslim world have a crucial contribution to bring to this war. It's your peoples, the people of this region, who have been most hardly hit by this barbarism. It's your religion which is perverted and warped. It's your culture that is being attacked, your identity that is being insulted. And without you, we cannot win this war, neither militarily nor ideologically. I think a Muslim who is fighting against jihadism will always be stronger and more legitimate than a non-Muslim in that position. And I say that today here in Abu Dhabi, whose leaders understood from day one the importance of the battle at hand. Your leaders, and in particular Sheikh Mohammed, have fully understood, I believe, that any kind of ambiguity, any kind of wavering would have disastrous consequences. A number of countries throughout the region have joined you now in a coalition that was very necessary indeed, and I want to pay tribute to the great anti-terrorist Islamic coalition that was launched only just a month ago by Saudi Arabia, with your support and that of about 30 countries, more than 30 countries. I certainly believe that we need to work with the new team in office in Saudi Arabia. Whatever our disagreements, anyone who believes that we can solve this crisis without Saudi Arabia is grossly mistaken. Now, of course, that coalition now has to bear concrete fruit. And as I said earlier on, we will certainly not solve this crisis only with airstrikes. If we want to annihilate the terrorists and the jihadists, we will need to have boots on the ground. As I was saying, troops from the countries of the region. And Syria could be a first theatre of engagement for such an Arab joint force. Failing which, another crisis will loom on the horizon, and that will be Libya. Because, of course, you can only imagine the domino effect if Syria were to collapse, if Libya were to collapse, and if someday, perhaps, Iraq were to collapse. Does anyone here believe that the problems of our day will be easier to solve once those three countries will have been destroyed? I certainly don't think so. In Libya, the Islamic State is gaining ground constantly. They're progressing towards the south, and the oil fields, having taken possession of the Sirte region, the UN agreement with a view to the constitution of national authority is very fragile to date. And here again, how much time has been wasted, and why have we stood with our arms crossed ever since the summer of 2012? In July 2012, elections were organized in Libya. Let me remind you of this, with a 60% participation in the ballot. That ballot was not challenged by anyone and gave the victory to the moderate forces, and yet Libya was abandoned and left to its own devices. And I have to say today that I'm also very concerned about what's happening in Tunisia. And the very courageous fight of the Tunisians should also be our fight. Tunis is less than 200 kilometers away from Nice in France. And I do apologize if I'm taking up too much speaking time, but I'd like to conclude perhaps with the following. You know, for Europeans, generally speaking, and for myself as a Frenchman, more specifically, peace and stability in Tunisia, peace and stability in Syria, peace and stability in Libya, these are very much our problems, our own. Because if those countries collapse, the consequences will be hardly felt in Europe. There will be no peace north of the Mediterranean if there is chaos south of the Mediterranean. I very strongly believe that. And any comparisons with Afghanistan will be perfectly idle. We could discuss forever whether or not intervention was called for in Afghanistan. There are arguments pro and con, but for Libya, for Syria, when the future of Tunisia is at stake, there is no question. We must help the moderate forces in those countries. We must give them support and help them fight their fight and protect our civilization, our shared civilization. Their fight is our fight. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, much too much time has been wasted, and the more we wait, the more difficult it will be to solve these crises. The more difficult it will be to find the funding, to find the right strategy for this war. If we are going to wage this war, we need to give it our all, with airstrikes and ground troops. I would also say that too much time has been wasted in striking the right form of alliance between our governments and yours. The West and the East must stand united, hand in hand, against barbarism, to guarantee peace and stability. The leaders of the countries of the West and of the East must stand united, hand in hand, with their eyes set on the horizon of the future that can only be built on the basis of tolerance and open-mindedness. I'm sure the concrete modalities of that will be difficult to implement, but I'm sure also that we will get there. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, President Sarkozy, for this invaluable lecture, in which you shared with us your perspectives on the challenges facing the world in general and the Arab world in particular. I will now engage President Sarkozy with some questions for 20 minutes and then open the floor for Q and answers session for another 20 minutes. So, President Sarkozy, you have taken us at the beginning of your lecture on the past of the relationships between UAE and France and how much progress actually was achieved in the past. But I would like actually you to give us your vision about the future of the Emirati-French relationships developing over the next few years.
La région du Golfe. La région du Golfe. Il faut que vous le compreniez.
Now, there's something you need to understand, I think. For the French, the Gulf region carries strategic importance because, in a sense, it represents one of the very few arguments that we can oppose to those commentators who say that the French power is doomed to decline over time. 30 or 40 years ago, the French presence in the Gulf region was almost insignificant. Today, France holds in the region a military base, and it has become a very clear presence, and a fundamental presence, and the leaders of the Emirates, as have other leaders of the region, have understood very clearly, I think, that you would be stronger with several friends from outside the region. Need I say more? Need I be more specific about other friends from outside the region? Of course, I'm a great lover of the United States. I love American culture, but the Americans have their own agenda, their own policies, their own geostrategic vision. And having several very good friends has to be better than only having one very good friend. Now, from that standpoint, I would say that France specifically, and Europe more generally speaking, need to understand that a great part of the future of the world will depend on what happens in this region. Now, a strategic partnership such as ours, again, is either a total partnership or is a meaningless partnership. Now, the present excellencies and ambassadors who are with us today, I hope they won't hold it against me, but today everyone talks about strategy, left, right, and center. Everything has become strategic and of strategic importance. And the word has almost become meaningless. Now, in my mind, that means that we work hand in hand, economically, culturally, politically, and that if someday your security were to be threatened, we would stand by your side. That's what a strategic partnership means. If a strategic partnership only means that you're holding some little piece of paper, to sell or buy this or that, and on the next day you have to sign some other piece of paper, that's not even a partnership, let alone a strategic partnership. A strategic partnership doesn't depend on one administration, on one individual. We're talking here about several generations of French and Emiratis who will be looking to the future together. We're talking about long-standing student exchanges, means also a long and fruitful exchange among our cultures. Joint troop exercises. And of course, it's important for everyone to understand that we share the same objective of peace and stability in the region, and that we're not simply, trading deals. Again, of course, I'm a former president of France, and again, on this notion of strategic partnership, I'm sure Pierre remembers this. During my presidency, I had decided to sort of handpick a small number of strategic partners for France throughout the world, a few for each continent. I had in mind Brazil, South Africa, Malaysia, Indonesia, the United Arab Emirates, of course. And you may know this French proverb that according to which if you have too many friends, you no longer have any friends, any real friends. It's very important to choose your friends wisely and to choose friends with whom you can show the greatest solidarity whatever happens. Now, of course, you all know that I have a long-standing and very close friendship with the Crown Prince, and I can only pay tribute to His Highness's courage and vision, thanks to which this strategic partnership between France and the Emirates was extremely easy to bring about. But for a president of the French Republic, I'll let you know that from a political point of view, opening up a new military base abroad is a very momentous choice, especially given the context at the time. I'm sure the ambassador who's present here remembers that truly sent a message, not only to the Emirates, but also to its neighbors, a very clear message that said to the rest of the world, France is present here.
Also in your lecture, sir, you have taken us through, you have presented your opinions towards terrorism and what actually it has been doing to the area here. So in your opinion, what ways can rational, educated, and independent thinkers and approaches confront terrorism carried out by groups identifying themselves as political Islamic movements?
Bon, je ne veux pas donner le sentiment d'être trop caricatural, bien sûr.
Well, of course, I don't want to oversimplify matters, but I think that the situation has reached such gravity today. It's perhaps worse than most people would say. I think the situation by now is no longer a matter for academics. It's first and foremost a conflict to be settled by fighters on the ground. Intellectuals, academics, theologians are, of course, extremely important, but they're important for the future. They're perhaps not quite as relevant to solve the present situation. If we want to solve the current crisis, we need to fight. We need to fight morning, noon, and night. The matter is really very simple. Are we, because we are more open-minded, are we the stronger or the weaker? Has our open-mindedness turned us soft and weak? I think Our open-mindedness should make us stronger. So, of course, there is a military fight to be carried out, externally, if you will, and there's also that other sort of intellectual internal front to be taken care of. You cannot begin to imagine the trauma that it represented for France when we discovered that French citizens who were born in France, raised and educated in France, who held a French culture, that those youngsters stabbed France in the back and took up arms against the French state to murder French citizens. And we're not just talking here about a few dozen people. It's quite a few more than that. It would be perhaps over-optimistic if I said we're talking about a few hundred individuals. This evil runs very deep, and that will lead us to take very difficult and certainly radical decisions. Now, of course, there's the matter of the interpretation of texts within Islam. Is there one authority, one hierarchical authority in Islam that can settle these matters? Should you organize different defenses against these phenomena? I cannot tell. What I can say is that on French soil, we will not and cannot tolerate self-proclaimed imams who will speak against France and the French Republic. Neither will we tolerate on our soil mosques where violent discourses targeting France or French citizens are allowed to be uttered. And I would like to pay a heartfelt tribute to the recent decisions made by the Tunisian government, and of course to everything that His Highness the King of Morocco has been doing for so long to guarantee the security of his kingdom. It's quite paradoxical, if truth be told. Arab governments have displayed greater courage and have been more decisive against these perversions of Islam than some European governments. For very long, we were of the opinion that what existed on your shores would never hit ours. Well, we've been in for a rude awakening. Now, the time no longer calls for explanations and educations. The time now calls for eradicating these savages. And that calls for, not for explanations and lengthy theories, but for fighting. We need to eradicate these assassins. We need to wipe these savages from the face of the earth. The time now does not call for theories or discourse. The time now calls for war and fighting. The time will come for reconstruction, but the call of the day, the call to which we need to rise, is not that one.
Developments in the oil market and the oil decrease in prices. What would you think the impact of low oil prices on both producing countries and consumers?
Écoutez, ce qui se passe montre que nous sommes
Well, I think recent developments show all too clearly that we have come to the last days of the system of the past. 3 years ago, the barrel of oil was above $100, and everybody around the world was complaining that this was way too expensive, and everybody was forecasting the depletion and the rarefaction of commodities and the explosion of the prices. Well, today, the barrel of oil has fallen to, what is it, $32? And some specialists are now forecasting that it might drop all the way down to $20 a barrel. You are sitting on a time bomb. And this is not only your problem, it's also our problem, because of course, tax revenue has collapsed for your governments today. But what that means for us is that some of our very best customers no longer have the means to buy our wares. It's no longer, I mean, you simply cannot describe this as a situation where oil producers have a problem and oil consumers are perfectly happy with the situation. Of course, you have to factor in the production of non-conventional oil and gas in North America, the marketing of heavier crude by Iranians outside of the regular market. All of that is true, of course, and has to be factored in. But I strongly believe that we cannot continue for long with commodities markets that are, to this extent, the object of speculation, because speculation plays both ways, both on the upside and on the downside. And today there are speculators who are making masses of money by betting on the collapse of the price of commodities. Why? Why would coffee, chocolate, oil, gas, you name it, steel? Why should all of these commodities see their prices set at London, in London or elsewhere? Why should the world's cereal production be sold 20 times over every year? That, I think, clearly demonstrates the massive extent of speculation that we're confronted with. And I would certainly encourage the commodities producing countries to organize together and to think long and hard about how they can bring about an organization where their commodities will not be so volatile and not depend to the same extent on speculation. Now, if this or that country in the region tried to favor a decrease of the price of oil, I'm not so sure that they're still controlling the development of the prices, the downward trend in the prices, if you get my meaning. And you know, when some say today that 2 years from now the prices will go up again, who says that exactly? The same specialists who did not foresee the collapse of the price of oil? I think that goes to show how urgent it is to better regulate the price of the commodities worldwide, to set up a better governance of those commodities where the major producers and the major consumers would allow for the market to play naturally and do away with these speculation phenomena, which I saw firsthand during the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, when some speculators were pocketing colossal amounts of money both ways, when prices collapsed and when they hiked up. I think a market cannot be the law of the jungle. A market has to be regulated, not over-regulated, certainly, but a market has also has to be transparent. And who can tell me today that they actually understand the factors that play into the price of the commodities? A great many commodities, of course, are indexed on the price of oil, with few exceptions, and the price of oil has a tremendous impact on most countries worldwide, and some harder than on others. I'm thinking of countries like Brazil or great countries like Saudi Arabia. The impact will be tremendous, and it has become urgent by now that we collectively think long and hard about the conditions under which the prices of commodities are formed. And it's not simply oil exporting countries that are concerned. All commodities are concerned. The world today needs new concepts and creative concepts. And I think countries such as yours, the 8th largest fossil energy producer, would be quite legitimate to put on the table of world governance this topic of a new system of regulation for the price of commodities. Now, that, of course, could have colossal geostrategic consequences. But the world and the world economy cannot withstand for long this kind of volatility and this kind of huge increase in commodities prices or huge collapse, which brings a number of countries on the brink of ruin.
Your Excellency, you have taken us also through the relationships between some countries here in the area. What message would you actually convey to the Iranian leaders to help us decrease tension in the area here?
C'est délicat de parler, pourtant. L'Iran est un acteur incontournable.
Well, that's a very tricky question. But of course, and I hope I won't offend anyone, but Iran is a very important stakeholder, and Iran also represents an exceptional civilization. The leaders of Iran, as I'm sure you're all aware, are excellent, very excellent diplomats. They are perhaps peerless in their diplomatic skill. And they are, of course, your next-door neighbors. Now, I think the question that we need to address to the Iranian leaders is the following. Do you truly believe that it is relevant and useful to write into your constitution the export of the Iranian revolution worldwide? I think the question that we need to ask of the Iranian leaders is the following. If you want to remain true to your history, to the history of your civilization, should you not be contributing to peace and stability? Because what can chaos bring about? Poverty, tragedy, less mutual understanding? I think Iran should be very proud of its culture and its influence. Iran certainly has no need to wage so many wars, to export tensions, if it just wants to call attention onto itself. Iran, this magnificent country, this long history, that admirable civilization, with those assets, they should not need to finance militias and terrorism. With that kind of cultural asset, it should be enough to take the floor to speak. A country of that greatness should be able to sit down quietly and talk. The Iran we love, the Iran we respect, is the Iran that contributes to peace, not the Iran that contributes to war.
Now we will open the floor to questions from the audience. I hope that nobody will repeat any of the questions that I mentioned, and I will allow only one question due to the time constraints. Yes.
Bonsoir. Bonsoir, Monsieur le Président.
Good evening.
Monsieur le Président, qui va sauver la France? Endettement colossal.
Faced with the colossal debt, the rate of unemployment in France, the problem with integrating new immigrants, the rise in the far right, the political turmoil in the European Union. Well, a Lebanese who studied in France, a Lebanese citizen who studied in France for 5 years and who loves your country, please hear me out. I think France is part and parcel of the identity of Lebanon. Mr. President, I truly believe in France. I think a strong France will be in a position to help others. And today, the world and Lebanon needs a strong France to help it save itself. Thank you, Mr. President. Well, that's certainly not an easy question to answer. But I'm happy that you said that and not I. Of course, I can only agree with what you just said, but I'm not in my country today. I'm visiting abroad, and I would not want to say anything that would give the impression that I'm criticizing the current French government. That being said, when I held office, I remember a state visit, a particularly emotional state visit in 2007 to the United States, during which I was fortunate and honored to address the American Congress, both houses of Parliament. And on that occasion, I told the American Congress that the French love the United States when the United States are great. We like the very large spaces of the American plains. We don't like the tiny little America. We like the America that stands by its lofty aspirations. and its great ambitions. And I think the same stands for France. I think France is loved worldwide when it has strong beliefs, when it takes chances, when it stands true to its friendships, to its loyalties, when it defends its strong ideas, and when it shows no fear. Now, that would be my answer to your comment. Now, who can do that, and who can do that for France? Well, I'm sure you can get my meaning.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
I would like to thank you for this speech. I would also like the organizers for this conversation. Mr. President, you spoke about the world, about ISIS. We support you in everything you said. But what about the Arab Maghreb? You know that stability cannot be achieved without this region. And we know that in this region we are suffering from the presence of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. All of this comes from the desert of this region. You have friend relations with Morocco and with this region. Isn't it possible to put an end to these problems? Of course, in this region, I would like to know what is your opinion as a previous or as a former president, and I hope that you will be winning the next elections. Can you please tell us how we can solve this problem in this region? Thank you.
Well, I was led to understand that that would be the last question. Well, it's a very thorny question, if I may say so. Well, first of all, because the difference between Maghreb and Mashreb, to my mind, isn't truly meaningful. Allow me to say that I strongly believe that the top priority, the top political priority for France today should be to work with the Mediterranean. And I think it's extremely unfortunate that my project for a union of the Mediterranean was mothballed, so to speak. Every time we turn our backs on the Mediterranean, we turned our backs on our own past, or so we thought, but we also crossed out our own future. This union for the Mediterranean, of course, I'm fully aware of the existing problems due to the Israel-Palestine conflict, but this union for the Mediterranean, bringing together countries from the north and the south to work hand in hand, that work is of crucial importance. We have His Excellency, the Ambassador from Morocco, with us today. Now, the border, the Moroccan-Tunisian border has been closed for, the Moroccan-Algerian border has been closed for 10 years now. Opening up that border would be so extraordinarily beneficial for Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia. Now, of course, Western Sahara has also proved to be a thorny issue. France's position has always been clear-cut. France has always defended the position according to which the Western Sahara is simply Moroccan, and it would take a lot to convince me of the need for a new Sahrawi republic in this country of the world that is already so deeply hit by terrorism in Mali, Nigeria and other countries. Now, I should also add that not every country is fortunate enough to have a sovereign such as the King of Morocco, who, in the midst of the Arab Spring, modified the Moroccan constitution, taking, as he did so, considerable political risks, which I believe were instrumental in guaranteeing peace in Morocco. Just imagine what might have happened if the King of Morocco had not made that extremely difficult political choice to pick the Prime Minister among the leading political party following the elections. I mean, that was a very risky political decision to make, and one that was very difficult to impose on his own friends. Now, Of course,
Ça devient une polémique.
Algeria is also very tricky to talk about. I love that country deeply, but discussing Algeria always leads to endless controversies, despite the tremendous wealth of that country, the beauty of its population. But the question of its modernization, of its economic modernization, has to be put on the table.
Et que j'ai vu les plus belles céramiques au monde.
Together with Pierre Lelouch, when we were in Algeria and we saw
Les assassins
side by side some of the most beautiful ceramics in the history of humankind, and right next to them, bullet strikes. I mean, that was a very stark summary of the conflict that is at play. Now, we need to help them, of course. Their success will mean peace for us, and their failure will be a tragedy for us. I was recently discussing with Donald Tusk, the chairman of the European Union, who was coming back from a tour of Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. And Donald Tusk was telling us that 10 million potential refugees are hoping to make their way to Europe. We cannot host them all. We cannot open our arms to them all. They will need to find work and peace in their own countries, failing which Europe as a whole will be overwhelmed by a tidal wave that will be entirely out of control. And I believe that we should set up today a kind of Marshall Plan, a European Marshall Plan for Northern Africa, and in fact, and for the Middle East, and for Africa as a whole. Africa, 1.2 billion inhabitants today, 2.3 billion 30 years from now, and there's only 12 kilometers between Africa and Europe. 30 years from now, the population of Nigeria will be larger than the population of the United States of America. Those are the realities that we need to face up to today. The birth rate for African families lies between 5 to 7 children per woman. Now, Africa is doing better today. There is economic growth in Africa, but who could possibly resist that kind of demographic pressure? Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to address this audience. I'd like to thank you for having organized this this event and this occasion for discussion and exchange. It was a great pleasure and a great honor for me to be here today. And let us not be mistaken. In France and in Europe, you have good and solid friends who love you, who admire you, and who wish nothing other than your full success. Thank you for your attention.